All right, well, welcome back, everybody. So this panel here, where we're going to be talking about biotechs and starting up biotechs, there's a lot of great questions here. So the first question, basically, I'm going to ask is, I've been thinking about starting a biotech company for a while on different topics, and I think there's people in the audience who have as well, people working in research. So it's good here to pick the brains of people who've actually been there, done that multiple times in many cases. So I'd like to kick it off and ask, what's been the most difficult thing you've had to face in your journey as, well, the question here is phrased aging company founder, and I want to just change it to longevity company founder because as a biologist, longevity, I think, is the proper term. So what is the most difficult thing you've had to face in your journey? So maybe we'll start on the right this time.
Well, sure. It's I'm actually not the official founder. I've been an advisor since the very beginning, but having been through multiple companies with the founder, money is always the issue. Knowing how much to have, how much the first things were. I liked the model we did for Oisin, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a fill or kill sort of option in the beginning, and we were very fortunate to have a lot of founding people that funded us to get the science out and see if it works. And then once it did, then it's a question of what do we do next. So it's always an ongoing play of how much, what do you need, but really having that budget in mind and that runway and that path to what we call liquidity. That's what I would say.
Two things that have been the bane of my existence. The first is tech transfer offices, so we try to avoid that when possible and develop everything in-house. The second thing on more of a program basis, though, I'd like to echo the model that James Payer put forth at Apollo, this idea that we want to have, as people that are interested in therapeutics that target aging, we want to have products that are going to have the global effect that we're looking for, but we need to be able to break those products out into specific disease indications that are backable by traditional biopharmaceutical companies. Now, there's a lot of complexity associated with this, not only with the translational path and issues that aren't ever brought up at a conference like this, like manufacturing, for example, but there's also a huge valuation problem. There is such a thing as taking on money with too high of a valuation. One of the things that I've observed, and I think a number of investors that follow this space have also observed, is that there's this huge gravitation of software and tech investors coming into the life sciences. And the risk models that they're presenting and the valuations that they're putting out are not consistent with the risk profiles of biotech startup companies. And I think that what we're going to see in this space in particular is a lot of companies that are able to raise seed and maybe initial Series A type rounds, but then when they need to put together the 10, the 20, the 50, the $100 million clinical raises, they're either going to get slammed because it's going to be a down valuation and all the investors are going to be ticked off with them, or they're not going to be able to close the round at all because the numbers don't actually have a basis in reality in the context of biotech risk profiles. So managing that entire platform of considerations is a lot more involved than I think it's given credit to at face value.
Right. I guess maybe I'd say a difficult thing in this space is to stay very mission-driven. I think that was brought up earlier, and it seemed like 80% or more of the audience, at least, they're pretty mission-driven. They're focused on finding therapeutics that can have an impact on aging today, and and trying to stay focused on that. In the big world of pharma and biotech and finance and everything that comes with it, I think is a challenge. And you can very easily kind of sell out to other models that may be lucrative, but they may not really be the best shot at delivering a potent therapeutic.
So I come from the professor world, and I guess the biggest difficulty I've had is that we, in my opinion, the disruptive discoveries that I thought we had made, that it took a long time for our startup to come to this point. And so, which is not unusual when the inventor or the discoverer thinks that they've done something important. But the process of sort of proofreading of science, at least in the academic side, is so rigorous that I think it slowed the development of the making products. And I think singularly that is probably my beef with what I've done for the last 30 years, but sure, now I'm moving to a full-time company position. Things will be hopefully better.
So listening to these answers and thinking what I would add to it. I hate to admit how old I am now. Going back a few decades, the hardest thing was going out to try to start a company where admittedly you have to raise tens and hundreds of millions of dollars. Imagine yourself, you're going to go out because you've got an anti-gravity technology. You're not going to get very far, right? So I remember one meeting, I was actually in medical school at the time, and I'm here in New York, and I'm out meeting with potential investors, and I'll say who it was. It was the Bleck brothers. Any of you remember that they were big in biotech once? And I was in a room with one of them, and they had a scientific advisor in. I give this whole pitch about telomeres and geron and how I thought this was going to be a big thing. And one of the Bleck brothers, he sounded kind of excited, and he turns to his scientific advisor, whom I won't name, and sitting next to him, he says, "Gosh, what do you think? This sounds really great, And the guy says, "It'll never work. Aging is inevitable. It's part of the cycle of life, and it's insane to believe that it can ever be intervened in." That's probably the greatest challenge. So it's probably also an indication that when this all begins to take off on that curve you guys have been showing, it'll probably be one of the biggest revolutions in the history of medicine, because the majority of the pharmaceutical industry really don't see this revolution coming.
Good answer. So I would say, for me, knowing that you are actually an entrepreneur was a bit of a challenge. I've participated in this community for, let us say 15 years. And apparently through all of that time, I had no idea I was an entrepreneur, because I didn't start a company to do something useful and helpful. And then a very nice fellow came along and persuaded me, and look, now I am the founder of a company. It is rather funny the way these things happen. So knowledge and connections are the only other two things you need. And funnily, there are a lot of people in this audience who have both knowledge and connections. And you could be an entrepreneur. You just don't actually know it right now, because the time has not quite happened. It hasn't immediately run into your mind that, I should go do this. There is a school of thought that says that people start companies when they can no longer avoid not starting a company. And I think that to a certain extent that is true. I eventually gave up running away from my co-founder sort of 4 or 5 months ago, and pulled the trigger. So all of you, out there who eventually might listen to this, think about what you might do at some point when you are ready. And all you need is money and connections. Not even money, knowledge and connections, because knowledge will get you money. Talk to people. Think about what you know. Think about what you could do. There are far too few entrepreneurs in this field, in this community, and that is one of the major problems that holds us back, I think, in addition to all the other major problems, such as the one you just mentioned regarding who thinks what about aging. Hopefully we'll beat that one in the near future. Thought ended.
So just to kind of focus in on that a little bit more, just you're a researcher. Just make up an example here. You don't know anything about business, right? You're doing experiments. You think you know the field pretty well. Think you have something here that is potentially marketable. You live in a research lab. Where do you go from there? You think you want to start a company, right? It's pretty daunting for somebody in academia who basically has zero, or at least thinks they have zero abilities or capabilities in the business sector. Who do you talk to? Who do you link up with? What are your first steps?
Well, I've never been a bench lab person, so I couldn't tell. But I could say that I think what it speaks to is having the importance of knowing where your strengths are and what you're good at. What I've noticed for companies that have not been successful when I was in the finance world was sometimes there was an academic or some was a person who thought they were also good at business but probably didn't have that business background and didn't find the right business person. And that's when those deals that we just talked about can happen, where when the time comes and you've got the data but you don't have the people in your court, the connections, as Reason was saying, that can help you and are mission-driven, then that can lead to somebody taking it over, and maybe it goes someplace and maybe it doesn't. So I think starting with a good team and knowing your strengths is really important. And second, I'd say know where your weaknesses are and make sure you fill those as quickly as you can with people that are much smarter than you. That seems to be what, in their respective area of field, that seems to be the winning formula that I've seen work.
But where would you find this team?
Well, I guess it just depends. I would start with your immediate network. Well, first I start with identifying your needs analysis, understanding what it is that you need. And then honestly, the power of LinkedIn is pretty strong. And you're probably one or two introductions away from the people that can probably help you. If you don't have already the network, you may find that by looking through and identifying your needs, you may already have the people. You just don't know about it yet. That's been my experience.
Two things I recommend. One, pursue advice from people that have done the thing that you're trying to do. Anyone that you ask for advice will give it to you, and they'll try to be helpful because people are generally helpful and generally want to help out. And the danger of that is people are going to give you wrong advice or bad advice, even unintentionally, if they have not successfully done the thing that you're trying to do. So when I look for advice on anything, I try to connect with people that I really have no business talking with in the first place, that have successfully accomplished the really ambitious things that we're trying to do. The second thing, and this might be a little unique to me because I do have a graduate level training in business, medicine, and bench work, but at Ichor, we have a philosophy that nothing is a black box. We need to understand as a management team in a very high level of detail all aspects of operations. And I see a lot of academics that are scientists that, they're going to get the business guy. I'm not quite sure to this date what that means, other than I generally see it as a bad idea. Whoever the founder is really needs to commit themselves to understanding all aspects of how the company is going to be rolled out. And what that means is when you're recruiting team members to fill in deficits that you have, you need to be selecting team members that not only make the correct decisions and have the experience you need, but you also need to be recruiting people that can teach you how you should be thinking about those things, why they're making the decisions that they're making, and that will level you up as an individual and allow you to make better decisions for your company.
Yeah, I mean, that's some great advice about, know your strengths, try to know what you don't know. Track record is incredibly important for investors, for your team, for advisors. All those people can, just looking very closely at their track record, that's of incredible importance. And then, there are conferences just like this, other scientific conferences. You can jump in and just immerse yourself in that and learn a lot very quickly. And you can get up to speed, whether it's on IP or regulatory or drug development in a specific area, manufacturing. You can learn a lot in a 3-day industry conference that has 10,000 people that dedicate their whole lives to that area, right? So, and then there are other programs like Y Combinator has the YC Bio now. If you're a more technical-oriented founder and you've got 2 or 3 guys, and let them vet your, try to put together your pitch, apply, and they give you a lot of business background, I think, through that process. I think that would be an incredible process for a new founder, that incubator, that accelerator, and other programs like it.
So from my perspective, if you have the knowledge, as was said earlier, and some spark, some level of creativity as a researcher, and the confidence that you can deal with people in the lab, as I had mentioned earlier, the peer approval through papers and grant processes and so forth is how we manage to succeed. In business, I think it's a somewhat different trust-building process, which I personally hope to learn. And I guess that learning process is the way, just about the learning process, whether you're an academic or an entrepreneur in the business world. I'm hoping that whatever level of humility I had as an academic, where I acknowledge that there is a lot that I don't know, the science, the knowledge is a vast unknown, and we are sort of nibbling at it. We even heard about alternate realities, which I had to contend with in the morning today. but be that as it may, if you carry over the same humility that you have as an academic into the business world in the way you deal with people, I am hoping that I won't do so badly. So, with the humility in my corner, I guess.
Why were you looking at me when you said humility? I was like,
I
have a problem along that line?
The way you speak, I like.
Okay, all right. I'm a model of humility. I thought you meant the other way around.
And success breeds. So I have role models, and like I was for academics.
Yeah.
So you are a successful entrepreneur.
I'm not
academic.
successful. So, hope I'll try to be. So, I don't think there's any one straight path and formula. I know there's not. So it's more like tacking when I'm not a sailboater, sailman, sailor. Thank you. So, but I know about tacking, right? You don't sail downstream with the wind or whatever. You tack, and that's what you find some way of moving things forward, whether it's partnering or whatever. You have to be creative and all that. One other thing that's really clear to biotech, people who've been in biotech, it's one of the toughest business models you could possibly have. The long-term horizons for most products, the risk associated with it. The thing that popped in my brain, trying to think about how to say it very quickly, my graduate advisor, Sam Goldstein, loved to try to impart wisdom to his students, and he sat me down one day and he said, Mike, it's a boxing match. The secret is you got to keep standing up. And, you go out, you meet with investors, and they say no, and you're crazy, and, the secret's just standing back up. That's all I could ask.
Well, there's a big gap. I think we all understand that there's this huge gap of horrible technology death between the lab and the commercial world. Why does this gap exist? This would be the question. Is it too few entrepreneurs happen to be scientists? Is it that scientists are really terrible at reaching out into the entrepreneurial community, who frankly are a bunch of cats and very hard to get hold of anyway? Is it because the entrepreneurs are really terrible at reaching back into the research community and actually picking up research before the researchers have, of their own, generosity, packaged it up nicely and presented it to them? And it seems to me that from my perspective, I'm not a scientist. I just read the output of scientists. I reached back into the community to find early stage research that had not been brought forward because they could not raise the funding and that I understood was good. And then I said to the guy, do you want to take this forward? But if you're a scientist, can you count on random people like me turning up? And the answer is no, you can't, because there aren't enough entrepreneurs. How do you fix this as a scientist? My thinking is that you probably find the inverse of what I did, and you find a way to make that work. If you are a scientist who wants to get something done and you've exhausted the avenues that you understand well, then you really have to find a way to reach out to the entrepreneurial venture community. And more than that, that community has to provide you a landing pad that you can actually find, because right now it's cats in a dark forest. If you're not in that community, how do you even know where to start talking to it? I mean, you can come to conferences like this, which is a great start, by the way. If you collar the right people, they're the ones with the red badges. But aside from that, it's quite clearly the case that I think the entrepreneurial VC side is really not doing enough to make this easy. It has to be coming from both sides. And because this is not a very mature marketplace, I mean, we're nowhere near as mature and organized as, let's say, the antibody people for random stuff that needs antibodies. We're still figuring this out, and we need to build the institutions, and that will come from both directions. And it will start with the ad hoc stuff where people have conferences and they bump into people and say, will you do this thing? And sometimes they say yes. But it has to get better than that.
So I think there's always going to be this dichotomy, obviously, between academic research and startups, right, and companies. To me, it starts right from the beginning, right, which is intellectual property. As a scientist, you're taught, get that information out there to as many people as possible as fast as you can, right? Publish or perish. And then you go into biotech, and they're like, no, you got to secure your IP first, lock it down before you tell anybody. How do you resolve that? Is there a resolution? Do you get IP first? Who do you talk to about getting IP secured? Every institution does things differently. Some institutions take like 75%, other ones take nothing. And how do you, to me, that's almost like the first gateway, for an entrepreneur. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's always seemed to me to be the case. And I guess maybe it needs further emphasizing from you guys. What's the importance of IP? And does it come first? Does it come second? How do you approach it if you are this researcher in the lab and you think you have a breakthrough?
Well, that's a good question. Like, we struggle with that question a little bit, but we've taken the approach where I think the IP is important is when you're securing, if you find something you're passionate about in the biotech space, make sure you have the rights and licensing to that entity, or if you're licensing it from an institution, make sure that you have that set up. From there, at least at Ocean, we found that IP is important, but not almost as important as like the secret sauce that you're putting together to make it work. Because once you actually publish your IP, or when you actually are trying to get your IP buttoned up, now everybody, including all of your competitors who may be in the same space, can see what you're doing. And then that can open the door. So as a startup, I'm not sure that it's the number one thing you need to focus on if you're trying to get into the biotech space, but I would recommend that you make sure if you are using a technology, you have the licensing completely wrapped up, and that you have a good legal team that can actually identify areas that might be pitfalls for you.
Those are some excellent thoughts. I won't spend much time talking about how we handle IP strategy because it's something that I think is one of our strong suits. But what I can say is that whenever we start a program, you don't necessarily need to have the IP right out of the gate, but you do need to have a clear path to IP. Keep in mind that the goal of doing drug discovery is to develop drugs, and that those products, really add a lot of value if you can add years to the end of the intellectual property, which means you want to file as late as possible, but not later than that when you're developing things. So our focus, although we want to have a clear path to intellectual property, and that's super important, we found that most programs have greater concerns surrounding topics like target validation, unclear mechanisms of action, things like that. And we believe that those areas tend to be of greater concern than building an intellectual property package around the technology.
I remember seeing a presentation. I think it was from Al Mann, who was an entrepreneur in LA, and I think he donated $50 million to USC or UCLA, and he was juggling between the two and trying to tell the institutions how IP is not important, and like the first three things are important for the success of a startup is money, and money, number 3, and then like IP was number 7 or 8 or something, But I mean, it is a critical factor in certain types of biotech businesses, like traditional drug development. If you don't own your small molecule, or if you're doing work on somebody else, and somebody else owns it, that can make or break a company all by itself. So I mean, you need to really pay attention to IP, but it is there's lots of other things that can kill your company, like tox or manufacturing or others. So one of many critical factors.
So I come from the academic generation where we were taught that IP is all important for a startup company. And the two universities I worked at, I'm somewhat sorry to say, were not entirely enlightened regarding saving time and expense. So in fact, the Bayh-Dole Act really, which returns inventions to federal inventions made with federal money to the universities, it is often misinterpreted by the, let me say, less enlightened IP managers at universities, whereby the ownership, university wishes to maintain ownership without even paying. So at considerable personal expense and a lot of expenditure of time involving how it is to be either returned to the inventors if the university is not interested, the ownership, or to be licensed to the inventor startup. It is a major, if in a practical sense, aside from the conceptual aspects, I think this is something that can be addressed. There are enlightened universities that have learned how to work this out with the inventors without conflict of interest. And conflict of interest is another major problem simply because the filthy lucre incentive is a substantial incentive that universities must protect against, and willy-nilly that has taken on the conflict issues require a whole lot of management. I was just wonderstruck to hear that you let the inventors deal with it, and perhaps the university should get, so I think that is the solution. Give it to the entity that wants to develop the IP and take something back because of the space that was provided. Call the university an incubator insofar as developing products is concerned for unmet medical or other practical needs in sciences, in the areas, other areas of endeavor. Please.
I was glad you didn't look at me when you said filthy lucre.
I use loaded words, but it's all in underlying sentiment.
You looked at them when you said that. So, a really smart guy I really admire, I think he's still around, Tom Kiley was the first counsel at Genentech. Brilliant man, just amazing. And his advice as a board member at Geron was, if it moves, file on it. That's simple. So, I agree, but I would just say that in my experience, IP, meaning patents, are generally more useful as a defensive posture than offensive. You know, most of our therapeutics take a long time to develop, but it's no fun being sued by, even a frivolous suit by another company over patent infringement. It's a real bummer. So defensive use.
I think I more or less agree with that. I will advance the radical point of view that the idea that a person can own an arrangement of data is a form of damage, one that descends into a variety of societal pathologies. So we end up with this university situation and the regulators and the government and various armed camps who all stockpile their weapons. And I think we have a better chance of doing something about aging than we do about turning around this stupid situation with intellectual property, which is an oxymoron if there ever was one. So, what do? You stockpile your defensive weaponry and hope that you don't have to use it, because if you do, it will be just as expensive to you as if somebody came along and smacked you over the head with their patent. It's really unfortunate. It's a proliferation problem, a race to the bottom. But you have to participate, because if you don't, then all the people who are institutionalized in these entities who can't move without knowing where they stand on intellectual property will not do deals with you. Therefore, so if you're thinking about how to do this pleasantly and nicely and simply, I will return to my reach back into the early research situation, find something that looks good, that's either in the scorched earth area of prior art is everything, patents have expired, nobody wanted to carry it forward, or you find a really promising line of research that you know is good and that the people can't raise funding for, which is really quite common these days because nobody likes the sort of barnstorming that we can do in biotech and which we will need to do in order to address aging. There are plenty of programs out there that can't get mainstream funding. And if you go to the institutions where they're stuck in that way, they'll be really happy to make a deal with you, a good deal. And you will get the intellectual property at a fairly low price that suits you. And hopefully other people, because the work is fairly distinct and early, will not be running around with their own IP that will come in and infringe. Everybody can carry on. And in my idyllic moments, I imagine that the market for therapies for aging is so absolutely stupendously enormous that any two companies doing exactly the same thing can float around and grow to huge size without actually bumping into each other. And we will see whether that is a fantasy or not as the senolytics industry develops, I suspect.
Great. So what would you like to see if somebody, if a young group of researchers came up to you and said, look, I want to show you my slide deck here, and what would you like to see in that deck or whatever pitch they're giving you that will convince you and say, wow, they've got it all together? What would be, or most together, what would you like to see that they have right?
Well, yeah, I used to help young entrepreneurs at the University of Washington with their pitches and sort of the ideas. I'd like to see sort of a path to commercialization, or a game plan. A lot of ideas are great, but that's what they are. They end up just being ideas if there's not a thought-out game plan and a time frame and then a budget that it's going to cost to get you to certain milestones you're going to need to hit. You know, in our field, in biotechnology, you may be 8 to 10 years before a drug comes to market, but that's not the only way you can make money in this field. There's all sorts of opportunities and milestones where your valuations can go up. And having an understanding of that, I'd like to see that if, a science-driven person thought of that, if they thought through the commercialization process as well as just the science. That'd be what I'd like to see.
Clear path to intellectual property, target validation, clear mechanism of action, full-time team that does not have other commitments other than what they're actually working on. Those are the things that I would prioritize. For our group, we work with a lot of different startup companies in our CRO capacity, so we devalue a team that has gone through the entire process before because we do more strategic partnerships where we try to leverage the expertise that we have in-house. So the things that I look for when we're looking for partnership opportunities is a little bit different from what I think a traditional venture capitalist might look for, but that's my list.
Yeah, I mean those are excellent kind of items on a due diligence checklist, and that's something I thankfully don't do every day now. But yeah, I mean it's another thing I think that is just kind of passion from the founders and seeing how committed they are to it. And at a time when I was kind of vetting companies, you'd have a dozen companies coming in and pitching you, and you are left with a piece of paper and some notes or whatever, but it's the kind of relationships and the drive and the passion that comes out of that makes that that person and that team's kind of committed to what they're doing. So that's always a big one.
So I'm just learning how to communicate effectively in this respect. I think I should pass and just continue learning for the moment.
I would. Three things come to my mind. One is, because I'm interested in aging, technologies that are upstream in the biology of aging. Like the ultimate downstream thing would be a hair dye. Your gray hair goes away. Well, is that really interesting to someone who's a gerontologist? Something that's, fundamental to so much of the age-related pathology and is upstream of that biology gets more and more interesting. If it's a platform technology, I gravitate toward platform technologies because so often in biotech you have to partner products and or programs with large pharma or other biotech companies, again, like in this TAC scenario. You give a lot of it away in the early days when you're small, but hopefully you get bigger and bigger and stronger, and you have a platform, so you have multiple products that you can make from that starting platform. And I guess now we're down in this rarefied atmosphere. How can you be all three? The third would be, is there a near-term application somewhere other than 10, 15 years downstream? Because that makes a huge difference in raising capital.
So I'm a zealot, so it might not be worth asking my opinion on these things, because I've funded companies that came to me on the basis of, my God, I want this to happen. The technology needs to be advanced. It's the technology. You shouldn't be going to anyone or out on the market with slides and decks hoping to get that reaction. Maybe you will, because there's a bunch of us zealots around. But that's not the way to success. I think realistically, if talking about what are the signs that these guys have it together in the way that you want to see if you're not a zealot, the answer would be that they know the dance. There is a certain set of steps, and if somebody who has not done this before comes along and clearly elucidates the steps that you go through to get a company going and where they think they're going to go, and it looks right, and it looks like it's done with people who know what they're doing, then clearly either they're cribbing from their older brothers, or they have actually gone out and talked to people and done the learning, and they understand what it means to be in business rather than just, do some science. And that, I think, it's kind of hard to fake that. It's especially hard to fake that once you get past the deck and have 5 minutes of conversation with the lords and ladies in question. And that's really as much as can be said. There is a dance. Most of you don't know what it is, but it can be learned. And that's what it is to start a company. You're just following the steps largely. And then as you get older and better at it, you learn how to improvise and build your own tune. But initially, we want to see that you guys know the dance.
All right. Is there anything further to add from the panel here? Great. Well, I hope everybody took notes, and we'll learn this dance and become profitable in the future. So thank you, everybody, for this wonderful panel. Thanks to our panelists. And questions will be during our break. And thank you.
Thank you.